Narberth history together. It's a little bit longer than form-based zoning code, but we're looking at it in terms of collecting our history and talking about our town. Because I firmly believe people know where you came from, know where you're going. You look at our background, look at our history, look at our housing styles. And Dennis is going to go for a little bit of a slideshow and talk about the different types of housing we have in the borough. And we're also going to start talking about what's worth saving, what's worth keeping, what should be replaced, what do we like, and what type of neighborhoods do we want to have in the borough. What do we treasure in the borough, what do we want, how we even plan for that. And that discussion will go on to what's going on presently, such as demolitions, a form-based zoning code, and some other issues with regard to properties in the borough and how we're handling it. So I'd like to introduce Dennis Montagna. He's going to give us a foundation and talk a little bit, then we're going to go into the town hall discussion in terms of I want to find out from you what you think is important in the borough, what your issues are, and we start talking about that discussion. So Dennis, great. Bring the lights down.
Thanks, Tom. Actually, I've done some looking at Narberth over the years, and mostly I've kind of been interested in looking at the way that the commercial core developed along Haverford Avenue and sort of the business center of Narberth down there and how that all took shape over the years. I've always kind of wanted to really look more at the residential and never really done it. So Tom, a couple of weeks ago, Tom called and asked me to do this. I said, okay, good, that'll be the impetus. Let me try to pull some of this together. So my intent really is to create just really, as Tom was saying, a foundation, just to kind of take you through how it looks like Narberth developed as a residential place. Figuring that's a really good thing to have under your belt if we're going to have a good discussion about how to sort of plan for Narberth's future, what things do we value, but you have to really understand what the nature of the place is. And it's a place that developed over really a number of years. In different ways, and I'm going to try to use those photographs and also maps to be able to really show that. The thing that's missing here is really archival material, things that you find within records, housing records, the way things got developed, who owned what in terms of development companies and all that. So that's another level that really still needs to be done. Let's kind of see where we're going at this point. So, one of the earlier maps of Narberth, I tend to like to look at maps of different times because it really begins to show you where the action is. It shows you what was happening where. This is the 1900 map. So 5 years after the borough's created, and you get a sense of where the residential development is happening. And it's happening, which makes perfect sense, near the Narberth train station. This station opened in 1870. So beginning in the 1870s and 80s, you begin to have a town developing of sorts in this area. So a lot of development by 1900 is in this area. A lot of sort of divided up land, large sections of land owned by different people but not built upon yet in this part of the borough. And same with this section up by Montgomery Avenue, but then some little pockets of development in other areas. So we're trying to figure out how that happened and why. Now, one of the resources that has been really helpful, and this is, I'm going to give a shout out to George Lonsdorf, who's a member of our, we call it the Friends of Narberth History. We're kind of a shadow government. We're kind of this informal organization, and we're looking for projects, looking for things that we can do to help learn about the borough, help them understand the borough better. And George is a map guy, and so what he's done is he's taken some of the old railroad atlases and has gone in and been able to layer them, create transparencies that you can see online. So if you go to the Friends of Narberth History, it's narberthhistory.org. You can go and they have maps from 1851, 96, 1908, 1926, and 1948. So you have really a 100-year span of maps, and you can click on whichever one you want, and you can talk them through. And so what I've done with this one is here's the 1851 map. This is the base map, say, from 1851, and then I've engaged the 1948 map, so I have an overlay, a 30% overlay. And you can't read it on the screen, but when you're in there, you really can development lays on top of a base.
Could you use the microphone?
Yeah, I didn't realize we were going to be competing with
Thank you.
the fire company. Do you know what they're doing? You should
Must be
know.
some kind of pump downstairs.
If you don't know what they're doing.
No,
Okay, so let me move it over here. I don't like being immobile, but I'm going to start. Okay. Great. All right, great. All right, so basically this is an 1851 map of the area that shows very large land. See the 104 acres at Owen Jones and Wynwood, and then it shows what by 1948 would become Narberth. You see two train lines. This is the one that's currently existing, the one on the bottom, Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad in 1851. They also had another line that went up here, so you can see what would have been running through the borough, although the borough wasn't there yet. That green line up at the top is the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad. And it runs sort of through most of the town. I realized when I layered these maps that it runs right through our yard. So, you know, I learned a lot from this little exercise. But because there was that railroad there beginning in 1832, a lot of the 19th century residential development, the pre-Narberth residential development, occurs up along Montgomery, which was the old road, and the area where the railroad was. So you can see up where it says, you can see part of where it says Libertyville. There's a number of houses that are there. In fact, the earliest house in the borough dates to 1722, the one section of it, and that's up, you see where that star is on the left-hand side. That's part of what became known as Libertyville. So there was a settlement there. Mary Jo Daly's house is up that way too. And then this other house, the 1803, that's the Price House, which is now the hamper shop for the hospital. And that's a very early. That's Edward Price's house. He owned most of the land that eventually would become Narberth. So even though Narberth was founded in 1895, residentially there's a lot of development that happened before that. So in terms of Narberth itself, when by 1881 is when the town of Elm was created, and that was the forerunner of Narberth. And what you have is you have sections of land, good-sized pieces that are being sold off, and individual houses are being built on. Now this is E.R. Price was actually developing this, and even though this doesn't look like a spec house, it was. They were speculative building, and with the notion of enticing well-heeled people to come and buy houses here. So Belfield, which is the house that you're seeing here, dates from about 1884, and it's on a site. What I've done there is I've taken there's the 1948 is the overlay. The earlier one is the 1890. Wait, no, the 1900 map. So you see where it's light gray. The light gray is 1948. So you can see what has transpired, what's landed on the places where those properties existed. So you have Belfield, which now is the site of the apartment building. So the Montgomery Court Apartments sit where Belfield once sat. In fact, there is still a tree in the courtyard area that exists from when Belfield was there. So you have to just go in there and you can see that. Now here's one of the other houses, the Edward Forsyth house is this one right here from 1890. So again, those first 2 years, 1880s up to 1890, we're getting fairly prominent houses on very large pieces of land. This one faced south, and at the time they talked about the commanding view down the hill toward the Elm train station that they had. And then here's that third house, which still exists. Okay, so this is Vauxhall Lane. So this is the house that was just recently rehabbed as part of the Methodist Church project. So that's one of those. So that kind sort of places things in time. That house has survived over time. So soon after Price dies, very, very, very quickly, a piece of what had been part of his property is sold off. And that was around 1887, 1888. And you can see that. So adjacent to those three properties we just looked at is this group of group of buildings that developed by 1900. This is the 1900 map, and they're already there. You can see it's already been, streets are laid out and there are houses there, and that's Wayne, along Wayne and Price, along those two parallel roads. And so, all right, so in the 1880s, what you're seeing is this kind of house. You're seeing what we call the American four square house. They're they're usually two stories with an attic, very, very square, front porch. It's kind of one of the quintessential Narberth houses. But these were the ones that really developed first. So these things are developing before Narberth was a borough. So this is that early phase of things. So in addition to sort of, within a few years, grand houses on big lots, then we're having much more what looks like a tighter suburban development going on as well. And here's an ad. One of the things about these houses at the time is you could get these as kid houses. So it made these very easy to buy. So the developers would buy these plans, and they would build from them. This particular one, let's see, 900, they pays for all the material with the exception of cement, brick, plaster for the house. So the interior finishes, the plaster finishes, the brick, the cement, what you would need to do the foundation work isn't there, but it gives you everything else. So then looking to see where else is, what other areas are being developed. So the closer in areas, closer to the center of town are beginning to take shape now. South Narberth by this time, by 1900, not a lot of building, but things are sort of platted out. Okay, so there's a lot of sort of planning that went into establishing lot sizes and establishing street structures. Again, nothing's built. This is all just sitting on a plan. What is getting developed a lot is Windsor Avenue. And so by 1908, this is the 1908 map you see on the bottom, and then you can see the four houses that are sort of pictured quite often that Windsor, the group of Windsor Avenue homes that is depicted in a period postcard are already there by 1908. So quite a lot of development close to downtown. In fact, the Narberth's first Burgess, so Tom's predecessor, the first mayor of Narberth lived on Windsor in this particular house that you see here. And he was also in the publishing business. He's the one that published all of these maps. So he published all of the Pennsylvania Railroad atlases that we're now working from. And then on the south side by 1908, the south side, the first several streets of the south side is pretty well built. So Woodside and Elmwood are both fairly complete in terms of buildings on that part. This is a postcard view of Elmwood. I believe it's shooting from the left to the right, if I'm not mistaken. It's hard to get this shot now because the trees have grown up a lot. You really can't perceive it the way we have it here. But at the same time, we're having that development closer to the train station. There's some other pockets of houses that are developing. At the same time, when these Philadelphia row house homes are being built on Woodbine, there's a whole group of them there. So in addition to building bigger houses, middle-class housing, we've got worker housing developing as well. As well as these, right down near the center, near the train track. There was a company that the Clothier, J.B. Clothier, related to the Strawbridge and Clothier family. J.B. Clothier is developing. They actually owned that whole swath of land that then eventually would become the Narberth playground. They owned all of that. And then they began developing houses. So by 1900, we had these little Dutch gambrel double houses all along Conway. So on both sides of Conway, the 100 block of Conway, right out here, are these groups of houses, and they're really worker housing, and they're coming very much out of kind of a tradition by the late 19th century of enlightened worker housing. A lot of corporations, producers that were beginning to create better housing for their workers, moving away from the large tenement houses that had been typical earlier in the 19th century to this kind of stuff. This is the S.D. Warren Company in Cumberland Mills in Maine, and they're building these much more comfortable Dutch colonial revival homes for their workers. These were published quite a lot. People really knew about them, and they were being emulated around the United States, especially in the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast, by the early years of late 19th, early 20th century. And as I say, things are being plotted out. This is the 200 block of Hampton Avenue. You can see the variety of lot sizes and some very tight lots. You can see there's up at the top you have the row house development, and here's I don't know, these are what, 25 feet. How did you remember? It was 30 feet width on these. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. So I mean, you have these houses being developed on these 30-foot lots, and very tight up in the northern part of the street, but then much more open. Well, what they're doing is they're developing every other lot. So conveyed with the house is the lot next door. So it gives you a more generous size lot. But in order to try to eke out more space between houses, another solution happens on the other side of Hampton Avenue, which is creating twin houses. Because a twin house allows you to work with the same size lot, but by sharing a wall, you get more open space between the houses. So it feels like you have space. And that became a solution that Narberth used quite a lot. And you can see that whole group of houses there. Now, about this same time, by the early years of the 20th century, within 10 years from the time they incorporated in 1895 to 1905, the population of Narberth tripled. So you've got quite a lot of growth, and then it keeps growing rather rapidly on up into the 1920s. The 1920s was a big growing period for Narberth. And I think in response to maybe, shall we say, some of the haphazard development that was going on, it's like, basically have little bits of property, people are developing it all in different ways. There was an intent, I think, with the creation of Narberth Park to try to do something cohesive. But it's hard to do something cohesive when you don't own much. I mean, you have to own a good piece of land to do something that is, broader in terms of scope and vision. So with Narberth Park, there was a group that was able to purchase 6 contiguous lots or pieces of land and then develop it in a unified way. So this is the 1908 map on the left, which the area that would become Narberth Park. And you can see where it says Berkeley. So there was a notion, there was an idea of gridding this out and really planning it the way most of the rest of the borough is getting planned. Homewood Street, which would have come up into Windsor. Now Homewood only exists up a little higher. But so they basically scrapped this, and then rather than trying to lay a linear grid system on a landscape, the whole emphasis here was to try to work with the landscape, let the landscape help dictate how you lay out a town or how you lay out a community. And there were some others that had been done in advance of this. And I think, again, I don't have the smoking gun for this, but I think one of the things that was in the back of their mind when they were planning Narberth Park is looking at South Narberth. Because, all right, so here, the darker section, that's the 1896 maps, right? So that's the way the south side looked in 1896. The lighter gray is the 1908 overlay. So by 1908, they had platted all that out. They had begun to build houses. You can see a number of houses spotted throughout Chestnut and then Marion Avenue. Then you also see a stream running through it. So basically, in order to create that grid, they had to blow through that stream. So the stream probably got buried. Everything got leveled to create more level building lots. And with this all having happened, I think that's one of the reasons why they wanted to really do a demonstration project in Narberth Park to show what might be possible if you used a different design thought. And in support of that, the development of the Narberth Civic Association, it happens in 1914. Our town, which was the official organ of the Narberth Civic Association, that begins in 1914. They published until 1949. All right, so The Our Town newspaper begins in 1914, same year as the Narberth Civic Association. They exist until 1929. One of their big kickoff events was to do the Narberth Day pageant, which is a fete that they carried out in the summer of 1914 as a way to begin to sort of push the ideas of developing Narberth Park. And I've always loved this graphic on their program because they have the Narberth Civic Association logo, and then they have the old sort of the past and then the new sort of the Indian representing the past, perfect for its time period, right? And then the sort of young child that is all about the future. So they were very much of a future oriented in terms of their development of the park. And it was designed by Robert Emerson Pope, who had been a student of Frederick Law Olmsted up at Harvard, had assisted with development of Forest Hills Gardens, and actually lived at Forest Hills Gardens in Long Island, which was one of the early well-known communities that was laid out along these principles of asymmetrical designs, curving parks, curving parkland, broader areas, vistas, and the ability to make use of natural features in the landscape. And that's what you see happening here, because of the shape of the land, the shape of the property dictated what they could do and what they couldn't do. There's also a big terrain shift. The left part of it, on that far side, is 40 feet above where the creek bed is. The rise on the other side is only 3 feet, so you have a pretty steep slope. Their organizing feature was that little creek that runs right through. They imagined putting a lily pond, which never happened. But the creek runs through it, so everything sort of emits from there. You have a community green, so there's so common land. And then because the site gets kind of wide, they then have that upper horseshoe. So you have the houses being constructed on the horseshoe, and then in order to accommodate the building lots, and this had like a little footpath horseshoe on the bottom. So really everything in terms of the layout of housing lots is dictated by the way the land works. And here, this is actually a spring of 1949 photo that kind of shows the way that what the matured Narberth Park looks like. This was shot by Ted Goldsborough's father. And you really can see that the common area and the way it relates to the drives on either side and the houses, and then the selection of trees. They tried to preserve as many historic trees as they could, mature trees on the site, as well as introducing native trees. So it's a whole different planning idea than what we had here. They had a supervising architect that oversaw the whole project, David Knickerbocker Boyd. Pretty prominent Philadelphia architect. He designed some of the houses in the park as well, and some of them were even. He designed one that could have been built. This was as a twin. See where number 11 and 13 down there. This is what could have been a fairly large twin house, and this was an ad for William D. Smedley, who was a builder here in town. And this one never gets built in the park, but in a way, parts of it do, so like half of it does. If you look at number 4, Narberth Park, it sort of feels like half of that a twin house. So you can see it was first completed in 1919. And again, these are cottages. These are small homes coming out of sort of an English cottage tradition. That's how it appeared in 1960 with its awning, planned in front, and then this is from 2010, I believe. Was this one that the porch is glazed in. But the form of the house still feels very much like it did. And another architect, Boyd's partner, was Victor D. Abel. And he built a house for himself in Narberth Park, lived there the rest of his life until 1949. And he had experience within worker housing in Baltimore during World War I. They built ship worker housing in Baltimore. He was in charge of that. He also had a role within some of the 1930s WPA housing projects as well. So he built this particular house. The sort of the Dutch gambrel house that you've seen in other places, very typical, very popular form around Narberth. This is one that it was touted because of its versatility, because they said this is a house, depending on the lot size, you could either have the entrance facing the street, or you could turn it 90 degrees, and the entrance could be on the side. And you can see in Narberth Park, we have two of them right next to each other that do exactly that. This is the home building, so the home building in Narberth Park and how it developed. The initial spurt of it, 1915, 16, then the war happens, so everything comes to a close in terms of housing, picks up like gangbusters as soon as the war is over. So 1990, so by 1926, really, Narberth Park is sort of fully formed. There's one more house built in 1938. But you can see we're talking about an early 1920s construction phenomenon. So the idea with Narberth Park is to try to not only build a community, but to try to hopefully have it influence other development. And it worked a little bit, not entirely. Augustus Luce was a Philadelphia businessman. He was one of the Narberth community leaders. He was one of the people behind that fete in 1914. So he was part of that group. He lived on Haverford Avenue in, where see what says Augustus J. Luce. That was his house, the blue house. That was an existing house that he had purchased. And then he owned that large swath of property, that 5-acre swath that emanates from the right side of it. Well, then he developed that right after Narberth Park. And this is what we have. So here's the overlay. This is the dark area is the 1908 map, and I've laid the 1926 map over it. So you can see what has happened to that piece of property. He's developed that by 1926. So this is Shirley Road. So Shirley develops then with houses that are really quite well constructed and reminiscent of a lot of the other park houses. So that was his. So here, rather than trying to do something linear, he was trying to make use of that lot in such a way that you create a curve, you create some vista, and you have a little more ample lot size. The other hope was that actual houses designed for the park would find places in other parts of Narberth too, and that's happened some too. It'd be interesting to do a project to try to really figure that out a little bit more. That number 4 Narberth Park house that Boyd designed in 1915 and built a few years later is the reverse of 320 Grayling Avenue. In fact, that's the last of a whole group of 6 houses on Grayling that are all coming out of this or a very similar design to it. So you do have a smattering of houses that came out of that. In terms of twins, I think this is the heir of this house. It's a more condensed version of it. So we do see rumblings. We do see Narberth Park expressed in other ways later on. The other things that we're beginning to see in the 1920s is the development of other pieces of heretofore undeveloped land. And we see that a lot along Windward Road. And there were some fairly good-sized houses. You can see on the corner, the David Ellis house. Right next to it was a heretofore undeveloped lot, which was purchased and became Windward Court. So that's kind of a little dead-end street. It just ends, but it has these very nice little cottages on either side of it. So that whole development happened then. So within a 2-acre lot, 2-acre site, they were able to get 10, 12 houses. Now, but later on in the century, we're having a different thing, where we're having not undeveloped lots, but rather some large-scale properties that are then purchased and then developed for housing. So you have what had been an estate called Edgewood, and there you can see again in dark is the 1908 map. Then we have 1948 overland. I'm not sure exactly when this was developed, but I want to say it was 1930s. It may have been post-war, but I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure about that. But there you have this central location, central access road on. So this is Langdon, and it creates a little cul-de-sac, and you have houses that are emanating from it. But look, they look very much like the 1930s colonial revival houses. But it took the place of that one large house that was in the middle. And then Narberth Lane comes later, 1950s development. So you have split level homes that are of their particular period on Narberth Lane. Narberth Lane took what had been a very large property just above Windsor. A lot of people who grew up in Narberth remember the water feature, they remember the lake there. And I think there's some photos that exist of that too. So that whole property went, and then you had Narberth Lane, and again, they had to work with the site, so you have a cul-de-sac that curves over to the right with then housing lots arranged around it. So that's basically what you have. You have really in Narberth constant development, either of undeveloped land in different ways, or redeveloping existing properties that had sort of large properties with a house on them, then being sold and then developed in other ways. Now, within more recent memory, we have the development of that basically took out the Spanish house at Windmill Road and Sabine. So there you have that was the Spanish house that dated from the early part of the 20th century. You can see the way it was placed on the lot. Some of the historic lot had already been sold off, so you had a couple of properties developed earlier. But on this site were 4 large houses developed, and this is one of the projects that gave rise to the desire to look at the Narberth zoning code and really try to figure out a zoning code that might fit Narberth better, that might allow for buildings to fit in with the Narberth context better. So when that demolition happened, and as I say, you can see the size of the houses. This is one of the planning maps that's being used now for the form-based zoning, and you can see where these four houses are really quite large. They're very large footprints, much larger than any of the footprints of the existing houses. So here's a question in terms of that. Again, looking at what might happen, how might planning happen. The ability to sort of keep an historic house and then work around it with maybe perhaps slightly smaller houses. So, and that was an intent. That was an intent made to have that happen here. That would have preserved the Spanish house and then had 4 more smaller houses on the site. So, in that case, it was a developer who was willing to explore that, but it didn't happen. But that's something to be thinking about. And the form-based zoning, I think, is going to allow that to happen better. Now, one of the things I think gave rise to this meeting is, or this conversation, shall we say, is what's been going on in terms of development of properties and the demolition of properties in the borough. This is the 400 block of Dudley. Number 418 was torn down, and there's a new house going up on its site. And I think that if we're looking at properties that are going to need to be protected, these are quite at risk. They're very modest houses, and they were built on alternate lots. So again, like you saw on Hampton Avenue, these are lots that are conveyed with the property. So that opens up a potential to sort of tear down the small house and put up something much larger. So what we're getting a house that's going to have a garage in the front, and it's going to be much bigger than anything else on the street. Perhaps not taller, but it's going to be wider than anything else on the street. And I think if we're thinking about Narberth's houses in general, we're not talking about great architecture. We're not talking about houses that are individually stellar works of architecture. But what we've got in Narberth is we've got a context. And we've got, what we're looking at is we're looking at the way houses relate to each other. We're looking at streetscapes. When you have major changes, it changes what that streetscape is. When you begin looking at these houses, you realize that as you march down the street, it's virtually the same house, but they're alternating the roofs on them. So you have a gable and then a clip gable, a gable and then a clip gable. So you've got a whole, there's a whole conversation going on as you move down on the street. So I mean, my argument would be, and something that we try to discuss is, there are ways of making these houses bigger if you want to have a larger house, but you can add additions to them in ways that won't necessitate either completely just destroying them or completely changing the way that they work from a public right of way as you view things down the street. And then the other discussion I think that has been happening recently too is there's a house on North Narberth Avenue that had gone down, and a very suburban feeling house has gone on its site. They're quite large house, scale-wise, not unlike some of the other houses on the street. But there's a question of, well, a perfectly serviceable house and a good-sized house was taken down to make way for this. Is there a way that we can be proactive to try to help preserve houses that are at risk that way? This is on this Google Earth view. This is the house that was taken down, and it was the twin of that house on the other side. This was all developed by the person who built this house in the middle. So there's a story to all of these as well. Not that the story should be what guides everything, but that was really quite a large house, and it was in quite serviceable shape, and it was eminently able to be rehabbed. In closing, I just want to maybe throw out a few questions for us to be thinking about among whatever else you want to talk about as well. And one of them is if we're going to have new construction, are there ways in which we can encourage more interesting design? I don't, my personal feeling is that things don't need to look like they've been here for 100 years, but they should be designed well. They should be interestingly designed. And a lot of what we're getting really isn't. And how do we discourage demolition of viable buildings? I can actually phrase that a different way. How do we encourage, rather than saying, how do we discourage, how do we encourage keeping of viable and reuse of viable historic buildings? And then, are there ways in which we can encourage the maintenance of our buildings? One of the issues with buildings that are purchased and then torn down, a lot of them have been let run down over time. So are there ways we can help people maintain their buildings better and in terms of training, in terms of other kinds of assistance? So those are some of the questions that I would ask. And I'll leave you with an historic postcard view of Essex. So I want to thank Michael Alexander for this. Michael's been collecting postcards. Former borough resident, currently lives in Seattle, but his heart is still in the borough. He sent me a bunch of postcard images. So. Anyway, thanks so much.
Thank you.